Ow. Ooh, that hurt. Hello, Jacksonites, and welcome back to Super Kaiju Binge. I haven't been on this very much, have I? Pardon me. Parenthood and full-time work sure keeps you busy. Also, if my voice sounds a little off today, I think I might be coming down with a slight autumn cold, but hopefully it doesn't sound too bad. Welcome back to Super Kaiju Binge, where today I will be tackling by myself the third installment in the Gamera franchise, which features the introduction of, by default only, Gamera's arch rival, Gamera vs. Gauss from 1967. Gamera vs. Gauss is a bit of a complicated monster movie for myself because in the Gamera community and the Kaiju community overall, this movie is a pretty popular film, especially amongst Gamera fans. If somebody doesn't list Gamera versus Barugan as their favorite of the Showa Gamera series, it's usually this one. And for the longest time for myself, I really was not a fan of this film. I thought it paled in comparison to Gamera versus Barugan. I didn't like the plot. I really didn't like Gauss. This was the beginning of what I don't like in Gamera films, as far as I was concerned. So for the longest time, I just really shit all over this movie for little to no reason. And well, I mean, I have my reasons, but upon closer scrutiny, and upon the most recent rewatch of this film, this is yet another King Kong versus Godzilla where I have a pretty major turnaround on this film. Actually sitting down and actually watching it and binging all of the Gamera movies, I found myself actually really enjoying this one. And I now do think it's one of the best Gamera movies, especially of the Showa series. Despite its flaws, I think Gamera versus Gauss is a pretty damn solid movie in the Gamera series. And is not nearly as bad as I used to think it was. Gamera versus Gauss overall, though, is an interesting movie because while it is an entertaining and enjoyable film, in some ways it definitely is a massive sign of things to come. I agree with what Bill said in his episode of Gamera Palooza. This can be kind of referred to as the Batman Forever of Gamera movies because here it permanently establishes the typical Gamera formula for the Showa series. It brings back kids in full force as the main characters. Not so much here though. The child character in this movie is almost a kind of a supporting role in an ensemble cast, and also introduces special effects that aren't necessarily bad, but you can definitely tell that they're a lot cheaper. And it's also just in general not nearly as dark or as thought-provoking or mature as the previous movie was. This is definitely in a much more campy and kid-friendly tone. But for this movie, it's really not a bad thing because this is one of those monster movies that both adults and kids can enjoy, which is good. It's always nice to have a good balance. As I've stated in my RoboCop 3 review, if you start to pander too harshly and towards a certain demographic, you leave the rest of your audience in the dust and leaves them disconnected. So only that sole demographic is the only one that's paying attention. And there's only so much that one demographic can give you, which the next couple Gamera movies definitely severely suffer from that problem. This one kind of starts it, but it does start it off strong, fairly. So as far as production goes, plans for a third film were immediately made after Gamera versus Barugan, and especially with a co-financing by Uni Japan Film Association. And due to the underperformance of Gamera versus Berrigan, director Noriaki Yuasa was brought back in the director's chair and as a special effects director, I think. Oh, yeah, he was. And it was decided that this is when they would full force aim the series towards kids. And apparently, this movie was made as a response to Toho's Frankenstein Conquers the World and War of the Gargantuas, with Noriaki Yuasa pitching to writer Nissan Takahashi the idea of turning Dracula into a kaiju, which actually, knowing that, explains a lot about this film's tone. So with that being said, let us get into the plot of Gamera versus Gauss. This really won't take long because this movie's plot is pretty simple. Oh wait, no. First off, a word from our sponsor. That's better. A series of mysterious volcanic eruptions in Japan impact shipping and aircraft flights. An eruption at Mount Fuji, of course, is a big bat signal in the sky that attracts Gamera, whose arrival is witnessed by a young boy named Eiichi, or Ichi, as Brandon Tenold calls him, our movie's child protagonist. A research team is sent to investigate, but they are killed by a sonic beam that is emitted from a cave near the slopes of Mount Fuji. A reporter named Okabe departs to Mount Fuji to investigate, and the Chuo Expressway Corporation's plans for a roadway face challenges when the local villagers refuse to leave. The resistance is actually a ploy to increase the bid on the land so they can get more money when they sell out finally. The foreman, Shiro Satsumi, played by the same guy who played Kesuke from Gamera versus Berrigan, which really makes me wonder, why didn't they just make him Kesuke from the previous movie? Whatever, because for the Berrigan, Gauss, and Virus, this guy plays one of the main characters in all three films, and in all three films, he's a different character. Whatever, though. Oh, yeah, so Shiro and his crew are turned away by the locals as Okabe sneaks past. Eiichi finds Okabe in the woods and leads him to a cave where Gamera might be. Okabe abandons Eiichi as the cave collapses, just as it starts releasing a greenish glow, and is devoured by a winged creature. Gamera arrives and battles the winged beast to save Eiichi. While interviewed by Dr. Aoki and authorities, Eiichi names the winged monster Gauss, after Dr. Aoki deduces it was awakened by the volcanic eruptions. During a meeting, the villagers become divided on whether to sell their land or not due to Gauss's appearance. Shiro's crew, save two of them, quit because of Gauss, and despite Eiichi's claims that Gauss is nocturnal, Gauss ignores military flares and proceeds to attack Nagoya in a pretty entertaining rampage. Gamera appears and battles Gauss for the second time, eventually ending their fight in the sea, biting off Gauss's toes in the process as the sun starts to rise. Dr. Aoki discovers that exposure to ultraviolet light causes the toes to shrink and also causes Gauss great pain. A plan is formed to disorient Gauss long enough for the sun to rise and kill it, using an artificial blood mixture as bait. Gauss is lured out, but the plan fails when the power station overheats due to Gauss's weight. The expressway is rerouted due to Gauss, and the villagers blame the headmaster who ordered them to hold out for their predicament. The headmaster regales a plan to Shiro, inspired by Eiichi, who's actually his grandson, to start a forest fire to kill Gauss. However, Gauss depletes the fire with a yellow vapor fired from his nipples. Damn it, Brendan. However, the fire does attract Gamera, and he engages Gauss in a final fight. Gamera kills Gauss by dragging it into Mount Fuji's crater, and as the authorities celebrate, Shiro affirms that work on the expressway will continue. Eiichi bids farewell to Gamera as he flies away, ending the movie on a pretty happy note and leaving the characters to lament the events of the film. So how about this plot? It's a fairly simple, straightforward but well told and slightly creepy monster story. I always did get the sense that they were trying to kind of add more creepy atmospheric elements to this movie to make it a bit more like a universal horror monster movie turned into a kaiju film. And now knowing that this movie was made in response to Frankenstein versus Baragon and War of the Gargantuas, seeing it now doesn't really surprise me at all. And I've said this before, but just fun fact, Gamera versus Gauss was released in the year in Japan where all major Japanese film studios released a kaiju film. Toho itself released King Kong Escapes and Son of Godzilla. Nikatsu released Gappa the Triphibian Monster. I don't know what studio released this, but we also had Yongari Monster from the Deep. Shochiku released The X from Outer Space. And of course, Dai released Gamera versus Gauss. And admittedly, I kind of have to think this might be my second favorite movie released in 1967. My favorite, of course, I don't know. Because I like Son of Godzilla a lot, too. Nah, this is my third favorite. But I like this movie's plot. Hi, Terry. I like this movie's plot. It is simple, but it's well told, and it has the ingredients that are needed in order to make this an entertaining monster movie. It's not bad by any means. It's, well, has parts of it that are boring. More on that later. But for the most part, this was another Gamera movie where everybody seemed like they were firing off on all cylinders and making the best of the limited resources that they had. So yeah, I like this movie's plot. So with that being said, let us jump into the pros and cons of Gamera versus Gauss. By the way, this might be a shorter video because admittedly, I don't have a whole lot to say about this movie. But just know I'll be giving this a pretty good fair shake because I actually do like this movie a lot more than I used to. Pro number one is I like the tone of this movie. As I stated, this is kind of like the Batman Forever of Gamera movies. It is a good mix of campy, child-friendly elements where kids can sit down and enjoy this movie. But there's also a bit more creepy and atmospheric. I totally lost track of what I was going to say. Yeah. Bit more creepy and ominous and atmospheric elements of Gamera versus Baragon, and a bit more darker elements too. Like this movie is a Gamera versus Baragon dark, but there are some moments that are a bit more gruesome than your standard kaiju fare. Like that's one thing I will say that is notable about the Gamera movies is that they're actually willing to show kaiju on human violence, whereas the Godzilla series and Toho films don't really like to dip their toes into that. War of the Gargantuas is probably the closest that Toho films ever got to doing that kind of thing, especially with Gyra legitimately going around eating people, but that's about it. The Gamera movies always felt a bit, well, when they're done right, they always felt a bit more edgy than the Godzilla series. But yeah, I like this movie's tone. It's a good balance of campy and dark elements. Um, and that neither of them overpower each other. It's equally campy as it is equally dark. So it's the best of both worlds for whatever your taste is in kaiju films. Pro number two is the build up to Gauss is quite strong. Um, Aichi and Okabe are walking towards this mountain that they think Gamera is at, and they see this green glow coming from a cave, and they're kind of slowly and skittishly walking towards it, and they're just like, "What the hell's going on here?" And the music is really low and a bit creepy and tense. And they do foreshadow the appearance of Gauss by seeing a fake looking Hammer Studios bat flutter by that spooks them both. So it's a good foreshadowing to Gauss because Gauss is pretty much just a giant reptilian pterosaur vampire bat monster. Um, yeah, the build up to Gauss is quite strong, and also how they reveal Gauss is quite good as well. You don't see him full on at first. You see his hand, then you see his eyes, and then you see his mouth chewing on Okabe after Gauss picked him up and ate him. And then you see Gauss's full form, and it's quite a good reveal, in my opinion. Speaking of which, pro number three is I actually do like the music score done for this movie. Um, Done by Tadashi Yamanouchi. This is the only movie that I know of that he scored, and it's nothing super special, but it kind of does make it sound like a Japanese Hammer film from time to time. And again, it adds to the movie's creepier, slightly horror-esque tones. But also, when there's campy elements that are showing on screen, the music certainly does complement those scenes as well, making them lighthearted and kid-friendly and fun. Um, so overall, this is probably the last time the music in the Gamera series would ever be good until the 90s. So get the good stuff while you can because we're not going to have a lot of good stuff for a long time, unfortunately. Pro number four is Gauss himself. Um, I actually now am a fan of Gauss. If you remember my original Gamera versus Gauss review, I stated that I'm not a really big fan of Gauss because he's Gamera's King Ghidorah. And while yeah, that is true, he pretty much is Gamera's arch rival, but that's only due to default because Gauss is the only Gamera kaiju to appear multiple times throughout the Gamera franchise. I still stand by. I do wish it was Barugan because Barugan seems like a much better anti-Gamera kaiju. But I guess as a close second, Gauss does fill that role in quite strongly. Whereas Gamera is the giant brick shithouse, Gauss is the speedy, agile speedster. And they more so in the 90s, but still in this first outing, they do play those aspects against each other very well. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Gauss as a monster showcased in this movie is quite strong. There's one thing about him that I really like, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Um, I do like his design. I do like his powers. His roar is also quite distinctive too. I don't quite think it sounds like the transmission of a car crapping out, but it is quite high pitched and screechy. And the reason why Aichi names Gauss Gauss is because he says because that's the sound that Gauss makes. And I think you kind of can hear it if you use your imagination. It sounds like Gauss. This is going to be stupid, but it sounds like Gauss is going, Gyaos, kind of. I know it sounds stupid, but if you stretch your imagination, I think you could pick out Gauss from whenever Gauss opens his mouth. Um, or maybe that's just me. I don't know, but um, and like I said, I like his powers. Although I will say that I don't think this has been stated, but I think it is pretty obvious that Gauss is Daae's version of Rodan because he is a flying pterosaur like kaiju. Um, though I will say I don't think Gauss is anywhere close to being a big giant Rodan ripoff. Inspired, absolutely, but you definitely can't say Gauss is a ripoff of Rodan because Rodan never spewed yellow fire extinguisher vapor from his nipples and fires a yellow supersonic laser from his mouth. That's for damn sure. Speaking of which, I do like Gauss's powers. His vapor ability certainly is a good foil for Gamera, especially since Gamera wields fire as a weapon and also eats fire as a food source. Um, and his supersonic laser certainly is a really decent power, and he sure uses the shit out of it. All throughout the franchise, he uses the shit out of his supersonic laser. And the effects on it are quite well done. And I like the science that they use to explain this ability for Gauss. And it also is a good working of the limitations of the effects, especially with the suit. Speaking of the suit, not quite talking about the effects yet, but the suit itself, I think, is pretty well done. It doesn't look rushed, or, well, slightly, but it doesn't look like it was poorly put together or it was um, just a rushed. It doesn't look like the condition that the Gamera suit in the first movie was put through. Gauss is well made, and he's a fun monster, and he certainly does wreck the shit of everyone involved in this movie. The next pro that I have to wrap up on Gauss, I like Gauss now. I think he's a pretty fun monster. But this will lead me into the next pro is the really good monster characterization. I'll talk about Gamera first when I get to this. In this movie, Gamera is fully, in my opinion, morphed into the type of character that he will be throughout the rest of the Showa Gamera series. He's fun, lighthearted, kid-friendly, surprisingly intelligent, and overall, he definitely does not anymore feel like a Godzilla ripoff. Because one thing I should have said about Gamera in Gamera versus Barrigan, he does kind of feel like Godzilla in that movie, being that he's just a giant monster who fights another giant monster for the sake of his territory. And he didn't really feel like he was attacking him because he's trying to save people and be the friend of all children. Um, Here, Gamera does very much feel like he's coming into his own being and coming into his own identity, which is really well done in my opinion. It's a good mix of Gamera being campy but also being serious because as soon as he saves the kids, he rushes in like Mighty Mouse. Here I come to save the day to fight against Gauss and beats the living shit out of him. Um, and you also get to see Gamera's fighting style come into his own thing in this movie as well. There is a distinct difference, especially in the Heisei series. Godzilla is a much more ranged combatant. He just likes to keep his opponents at bay with his atomic breath and just blast them to pieces, and only gets hand to hand as a last resort. Godzilla can certainly fight hand to hand when the opponents close the distance, but Godzilla's a much more ranged combatant. Whereas Gamera in this movie, they showcase that he's a close quarters combatant. He likes to use his hands and his teeth and claws to rip his foes to pieces, and he uses his energy attack mainly just as a foil to their own attacks, and also to corral them into a environment of his choosing so that he can more easily tear them to pieces. And he also does use his flight abilities to good use in Gamera, just as a common tactic of attacking his foes, smashing into his foes and knocking them off their feet. Um, which is probably the best advantage that Gamera would have in a fight against Godzilla. That is, if Godzilla doesn't shoot him down. Excuse me. And as far as anyway, so real quick to finish up on Gamera, overall, I love Gamera's characterization in this movie. This is how he would act for the rest of the Showa series. It's a little disappointing that he's just not quite as monstrously badass as he was in Gamera versus Barrigan. But it's weird. It's a really good compromise. Gamera loses the edge of being more monstrous and more badass and destructive that he was in Gamera versus Barrigan. But he also gains a much more personable attitude and personality in this movie, which makes him a lot easier to relate to. And also one thing, this isn't a pro per se, but it could be seen as one. Gamera does have plenty of screen time in this movie, which is a big step up over the previous movie. And thankfully, this movie does not feel like like a Gauss movie that was a solo Gauss movie that was shoehorned into being also a Gamera movie. This feels like the filmmakers from day one wanted to make, okay, we want to make Gamera 3 Gamera versus Gauss. Let's actually incorporate Gamera into the story a lot better, which this movie does as well. And now let's move on to Gauss's character in this movie. One of the best things that makes Gauss a fun monster, mostly in this movie, in Guiron, you could definitely say there's a carryover because Gauss still feels like a sadistic monster as he is in this movie, but he is also just mostly cannon fodder in that movie for Guiron. Oi. And in the Heisei series, they're just mindless, hungry animals. And they're barely in Gamera the Brave, but Gauss's personality in this movie is very, very, very strong. He does at times come off as being a hungry, animalistic monster, but also he does feel like he has some sense of sentience to him, and he does feel like he has a sadistic personality. Like he enjoys toying with his prey, and he enjoys being cruel and mean and sadistic to Gamera and his foes. He doesn't just feel like a generic giant monster. He feels like he's more his own thing, and he has a mind of its own, and that makes him a lot of fun to watch. Um, so that's something that's really well done in this movie, in my opinion. I lost track of my pros. Pro number 6 is the monster action in this movie is overall pretty good. Not talking about the fights, we're just talking about the well, no, I guess you could say that Gauss's first rampage throughout Nagoya is a lot of fun, and this I do like that since this is the first time that Dai is really in court. Well, I mean, Gamera can fly too, but he's a trifibian, whereas Gauss is obviously at home very much so in the air. So this is the first time that Dai really showcase their abilities to show a flying kaiju go on a rampage. And I think it's pretty well done. Another thing that is similar to Rodan is that Gauss does also use his wings to create heavy windstorms, but that's not his main tactic, unlike Rodan. Of course, Gauss's main tactic for going on a rampage is using his supersonic beam. And boy, does he use that thing in this movie. He cuts apart buildings, planes, cars, tanks, bridges, Gamera. He fucks everything the fuck up with his laser in this movie, and it's a lot of fun to watch. Real quick, I'll say the effects on the beam kind of somewhat vary from time to time. It's mostly like when Gauss slices a pagoda in half. Um, it doesn't really. It's not really sliced apart in the way that you might think it would be. The pagoda is standing like this, and instead of this, I think this was done in the Heisei series. When the beam passes by the building, there's not a piece of it that slowly slides down. When the building is sliced, the beam goes into it, and a piece of it lifts off like it's on a hinge, and then it just flaps back down. If a building was to be sliced in half like that, that wouldn't happen. And also, most notably, this drives me nuts every time I watch this movie. When the plane at the beginning of the movie is sliced in half, it slowly pulls apart and everyone falls out of the building. If the plane was to be actually sliced in half mid-air, especially, it would instantly just break apart. Um, so that throws me off a little bit, but for the most part, the slicing effects with Gauss's laser beam are for the most part pretty well done. Um, and once again, I will say that this series is pretty consistent on the humans coming up with creative ideas to defeat the kaiju, like the freezing bombs, the convenient ass Plan Z to shoot Gamera into the sky, um, using an artificial or no, using a diamond that's artificially enhanced to lure a monster into water, using a giant mirror to reflect a monster's rainbow beam, and here, them creating an artificial human blood solution and using some limitations and special effects to their advantage in defeating the monster. I may as well talk about this. The special effects in this movie are, I would say, about 70% of the time pretty good. The good does outweigh the bad, thankfully. Um, the miniature sets like Nagoya and the forests and the baseball stadium in this movie all look pretty well constructed and well executed and well detailed. And they look great when they're destroyed, especially the forests. I totally buy them as being forests. And they're well detailed. Kind of does look like something out of either War of the Gargantuas or Frankenstein versus Baragon. Um, and matter of fact, a couple times I was wondering, are we going to see Gyra or Sonda out here? Not really, but does make you think. Um, the Sunimation for Gauss and Gamera is pretty well done. Um, the beam effects for Gauss's sonic laser are pretty well animated. Um, Gamera's fire effects aren't quite as strong as they were in the last two movies. Um, where it the effect is the same. It's pretty much a Gamera puppet that spews out fire, but here even more so, it just looks like a puppet. Gamera's head doesn't move, but his hands and arms do, and his head remains totally stagnant. At least in the last two movies, Gamera's head does move somewhat, so it looks not nearly as stiff as it does in this movie, but still here it's passable. Um, the volcano effects also look really good, like when Gamera is sitting next to a river of lava. It's obvious it's just like a plastic piece that's moving along on a treadmill, but still, it's imaginative enough and creative enough to be convincing as lava. Um, the cave sets for Gauss also look really good. And moving on to Gauss's suit, I do like that the filmmakers knew that there's one thing about Gauss's design that is really strange. Um, they explain how Gauss is able to fire off his supersonic laser is that his throat is forked like a tuning fork inside of his neck, and sound waves resonate between the forks in his throat, and he's able to channel them into a beam out of his mouth, and that's able to slice through any material. It is based on real life technology, um, so that's cool. The problem with that, though, in terms of Gauss as a monster, Gauss can't turn his head. He very much has it's like his vertebrae in his neck are fused, and this does happen to people in real life who get their vertebrae fused. They can't, in their neck or their spine, they can't turn their head or like twist their back around. So they have to, like, if someone has their neck fused, kind of like rubber suit Batman syndrome. In Tim Burton's Batman, the rubber they used for Michael Keaton's bat suit, it was so stiff and thick, Michael Keaton couldn't really turn his head. It was very difficult for him to do so. So instead, he kind of had to turn his body in order to look side to side. Gauss somewhat does that too, but they showcase in this movie that because Gauss can't turn his head, Gamera attacks him from behind and takes him from behind. um, but they explain that limitation of the effects in this movie, and they use it to their advantage, which is really cool. And they also use the fact that Gauss is a flying kaiju well to their advantage as well. And they're not being just lazy by deciding to shoot Gauss down with planes. They're being more creative by having Gauss land on this pedestal with the artificial human blood solution. And while he's drinking that, they'll spin it around. And since Gauss can't move he's not very articulate, he'll lose his equilibrium and he'll spin around and stay in place. It doesn't work, of course, because of the convenience of the plot. But still, I like that the writers are being more creative, and especially with Gauss's suit design, that the effects guys were using their limitations to their advantage, and they're trying to be smart about it. So I respect them a lot for that. Overall, the special effects, there are some major flaws, which I'll get to in a few minutes. But overall, yeah, the suitimation is well done. The miniatures are well made. The beam effects look great. The fire effects are adequate. And overall, yeah, they're pretty well done. They're cheaper, which you can tell. But again, they are using limited resources to their advantage and trying to be more crafty and creative. And you can see that very well on screen. Pro number 7, or 8 actually. 7 was the special effects. The final pro that I have for this movie, pro number 8, is the monster battles. There's 3 in this movie. Gamera's first fight after saving Aichi, Gamera's second fight with Gauss, which ends in him biting off his toes in the middle of the sea, and the third and final fight, which ends with Gamera brutally dragging Gauss to his death in the crater of Mount Fuji. They're all very entertaining. There's a lot more dynamic moves and a lot more just energy and enthusiasm into these monster fights, and they use their abilities very well to their advantage. Again, Gamera is kind of like a brick shithouse, and it's just like a big battering ram rocket, and Gauss is an agile speedster missile. And also, Gauss does use his flying abilities very well to his advantage, as well as his extinguisher nipples, and of course his supersonic laser, and which leads Gamera to rely more on his tenacity and his tooth and nail fighting style, which is great. They're a lot of fun to watch. They're very dynamic. They're a lot better than the fights in Gamera versus Berrigan, and you could tell that the film crew was a lot more comfortable making monster fights in this movie. And there's 3 for you to pick from, so you certainly do have a good sense of variety. I do though think the weakest one is the first, but that's just because it's a little too short for my tastes. But still, it's fun, and the monster fights in this movie certainly don't disappoint. But with all these good things to say about Gamera versus Gauss, I do have some problems with this film. Con number one is I don't think this movie is paced very well. When they're well, this has to do with one serious problem with this movie. So actually, now I think about it, I'm going to save that for a little later. So con number two, the human characters in this movie aren't very good. They're not terrible by any means, and this is one area where Gamera versus Gauss is a disappointment compared to Gamera versus Berrigan, in the fact that its human cast just aren't that interesting. Here, they're just serviceable. They're here to fill out a human cast, fill out military personnel and scientist personnel, and just main characters that you don't really get attached to, even though you're supposed to. I will say though, Eiichi in this movie is probably the most tolerable child character in the Showa Gamera series. There's a couple moments where he gets slightly annoying, but that's mostly toward the end of the movie. Um, but he's not nearly as annoying. Like, he doesn't intentionally put himself in danger like so many other Gamera kids do. He doesn't try to sabotage any plans to attack Gamera or Gauss. He's not a pain in the ass. He doesn't get in the way. Eiichi is just a spectator and even a kid who inspires the main characters for some plans to defeat Gauss. So he's in that sense, he's actually pretty what's the word? Proactive in the film's plot. So surprisingly, Eiichi is pretty tolerable in this movie. There's a couple of moments where he is a little obnoxious though. So he's a kid in a Gamera movie. Of course he's going to be obnoxious a couple of times, but compared to others, especially in the next movie, oi. But overall, yeah, the human cast in this movie really is nothing special. They're a big step down from Gamera versus Berrigan, and they're just not nearly as interesting. Um, Con number two, the main flaw, or three, excuse me, the main flaws in the effects are mostly some of the miniatures, like the miniature Mount Fuji or the miniature Gauss cave that they showcase in this movie look absolutely terrible. They literally just look like fourth grade science projects that they shot a camera at to use those as actual exterior shots for Gauss's cave and Mount Fuji, and they just look terrible. They look so obviously miniature and they don't look convincing at all. The green screen effects are also terrible. Not nearly as bad as what they will be in the next couple of movies. But still, they definitely do start the trend of having bad green screen effects. Actually, I'd say for the rest of the Showa series, the blue screen effects are bad. So actually, in hindsight, these are probably the best, but they're still not that great, unfortunately. And also, there's lots of moments where when Gamera and Gauss are flying, you can see the strings on the props. And speaking of which, whenever Gauss is flying, like full on flying like an airplane, he looks like an airplane. He doesn't move his wings at all. He just looks like a stiff prop that they're swinging through the air on strings. And a really noticeable scene is when Gamera is flying Gauss to Mount Fuji to kill him. When he starts his jets and he lifts up in the air, you can clearly see the strings that are pulling up the Gamera and Gauss props. It sticks out like a sore thumb. It's really distracting, and it almost feels like a flub they intentionally kept into the movie, and it takes me out and just makes me think, oh my god, you guys couldn't have done a better take. You couldn't have tried to hide the strings even better than that. No. Um, but the last two cons with this film, The pacing, which really isn't that, it's not terrible by any means. There's just the end of the second act is when the movie really starts to drag because there's nothing really all that interesting left in the movie other than just waiting for Gamera to show up for the final time to kill Gauss, because the human characters aren't that interesting. And hands down, the biggest problem with this movie is the stupid expressway subplot. My God, is this just boring? Boring, boring, boring as fuck. You don't give a goddamn about this part of the movie. You don't give a damn about these greedy, money grubby, poor ghetto assholes wanting to screw a big company over for a whole bunch of money. You just don't give a goddamn. All these characters, they act so hostile and unlikable and mean towards the main characters, yet the movie tries to showcase them as being sympathetic for them not wanting to have some big corporation come through and destroy their land. But then they act like, oh no, we want more money, but we're going to be dickheads about it. Like, what? No, I'm sorry, guys. This expressway subplot, it's really boring. It's really drawn out. And it's in that second half of the second act is when it reaches its peak of boredom. And you're just like, oh my God, guys, move on already. Nobody gives a fuck about this subplot. Nobody cares. When the movie is focusing on just combating Gauss and having Gamera fight Gauss, um, the movie is 10 times better. But when the movie focuses so hard on this expressway toward the end of the movie, it brings the pace to a screeching halt. And it, oh God, it just drives me crazy. I hate this part of the movie. Like Anthony here is saying, it may have been a good way to get the movie started, sure, but having it pop up 2 or 3 times throughout the rest of the movie was overkill and brings the pace to a screeching halt. This is easily the worst part of the entire movie, and really is the biggest thing that I dread watching whenever I do watch Gamma versus Gauss. So I think in the future I might just skip it. But whew, my God. So overall, that's all I have to say about Gamera versus Gauss. Surprisingly, now that I actually did sit down and watch the movie, this was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it a lot more than I used to. I used to consider this to be one of my least favorite Gamera movies, but now, no, it's a fun flick, and I do enjoy it quite a bit. In some ways, it is a bit of a downgrade compared to Gamera versus Berrigan. Like, if you're a big fan of those of monster movies that have more darker and edgier plots and more mature and darker themes, this movie might not do it for you. But if you're a fan of stuff like Frankenstein versus Baragon or War of the Gargantuas, this movie might actually wet your whistle. It's a good mix of campy and darker element. Well, yeah, campy and darker elements, and especially if you're a fan of monster versus monster movies, because this movie certainly delivers on that. Um, it's a good mix of campy and dark. It's fun. It's entertaining. For the most part, it's well made, though you can definitely tell when they're cutting corners. But still, it reminds me of Godzilla versus Gigan in that sense, where with Gigan you can tell that despite their limited resources, the filmmakers were still giving it their all. I get the sense that's what they are doing with this movie. So, with all that being said, I'm going to give Gamera versus Gauss a 7.5 out of 10. I do recommend it. And of course, if you're a Gauss fan, this is, of course, the introduction of that monster, the introduction of Gamera's King Ghidorah, so to speak. So it's definitely worth watching, at least for that. Um, so yeah, that's all I have to say. Post your comments down below. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button and hit the subscribe button and share this video with your friends. And join me tomorrow where I review a double feature of two of the worst Gamera movies of the entire franchise, with a double feature of both Gamera versus Virus and Gamera versus Guiron. I'll see you guys for that video, but until then, if you see a green ominous glow coming from a cave near Mount Fuji, don't go near it. There's probably a giant monster in there. And I will see you guys in the next video.